The title of my lecture is Nuclear Energy for the Future. I want to emphasize the importance of the phrase "for the future." This is not a lecture dealing with past problems, with current problems. It's a long look ahead of where nuclear energy is going. But of course, there will be a little bit of history in this also. Now, nuclear energy is going, presumably, I think, over some decades from now, into an entirely new phase, because the nuclear reactors that will be built then, say after about 2035 or 2040, will be Pebble Bed Reactors. I must say that the topical selection Jane is responsible for, because she asked me especially what the Chinese are doing now and what the Russians are doing now and what's coming up in the future. And that's sort of colored the nature of this presentation. So a brief look at the past, a brief look at the near term, and then a more detailed look at where we are going. That's the topical subjects here. I had two collaborators. One is Reinhard Seiser. He's a postdoctoral fellow from the University of Graz in Austria, who has worked on and off with me at the university. And then a real expert on Pebble Bed Reactors, which is Kenneth Schultz from General Atomic. And I will be talking about their reactor system, some of their past failures, and then some of their future hopes, which are all bound up in where nuclear reactors are likely to go. Most of the stuff that's going to be projected is for my benefit so that I don't skip important topics. On the other hand, the summary here is really pretty inclusive. After a 30-year hiatus, the designs of an improved water-cooled nuclear reactor are being developed by two groups. This is the current development, which will hopefully lead to a new, improved type of conventional nuclear reactor by perhaps the year 2013, 2015. The high-temperature helium-cooled Pebble Bed Prismatic Reactor, that's an entirely new, safer, less costly type of reactor, and as I will elaborate, is not likely to be in commercial use until about 2035. And I will also say a few words about the breeder reactor, which unfortunately was shut down as an international program around 1998. And several of us put together a book at the time on advanced nuclear reactors, which includes the breeder reactor and also the fusion reactors. That's a little book that we published, and it's an international swan song. I think that's the right designation for it, because the authors came from all over the world, and they were all in the same boat. The programs were being terminated everywhere at the same time. And it was our hope that by putting that book together, we could somehow preserve technology for the future. Although I have doubts about that. You can't really put technology on a bookshelf and pick it up again. It takes more than that. All right, that gives you some idea of where we are going. There's a very brief overview of nuclear reactor development. There's always a question of when did it really begin? Well, it really began when Einstein's equation, energy-mass, the energy-mass relation, was proposed by him around the beginning of the 20th century. So it goes way back to that. The practical implementation of that wonderful idea, which has been checked innumerable times, came, I think, first in 1930 at a World Power Conference in Berlin, where a distinguished English scientist, Arthur Eddington, challenged the audience. Here you've got this wonderful relation. Let's see what you can do with it in a practical sense to take advantage of the fact that a change in mass produces an enormous change in energy. The realization from the experimental point of view, from the engineering point of view, is of course connected with the Manhattan Project of World War II, and the first nuclear pile was operated by Fermi in December 42. Now we want to look at the present, and this is as much of the present as I'm going to say. Nuclear energy worldwide is generating 16% of the world's electrical power. That's not 16% of the total energy, because transportation energy isn't included in here. This is the electrical power. And of that, 16% comes from nuclear reactors all over the globe. 65% comes from oil, and 19% from hydroelectric and geothermal, which are in some sense renewable. We can argue about whether they are really renewable. That's another question. The percentages vary very widely by country. At the present time doesn't mean today, it means, give or take a couple of years in the past. The French were generating 77% of their electricity from nuclear energy. The Japanese, 35%, the US, 20%, and the Canadians, 15%. And all the other countries in the world are somewhere on that scale. No one else quite as high as the French, and a good few even lower than the Canadians. Now, where are most of the nuclear reactors? Well, they're in the United States, even though we only generated 20% of our energy that way. We are such prodigious users of electricity that even at the 20% level, of the 440 or so, that's also not today's number, it's more or less 440, 104 are in the United States. Okay, that tells you a little bit about that. Now I want to go to the US Department of Energy designation of nuclear reactor types. That's their chart and their definition of where we've been and where we are going. Please note the time scale on the bottom here. Around 1950 to the late 1960s, we built what are called the Generation 1 nuclear reactors. They were small nuclear reactors. They were built with Department of Energy money mostly, some commercial interests, but not very many. They all have very nice names: Shippingport, Dresden, Fermi, and Magnox. And around 1970, commercial power reactors entered the market for the first time. And that is the period from, say, 1970 up to about 1995 or so. And the important reactors of that period are the BWRs, the boiling water reactors, and the PWPRs, the pressurized water reactors. They are reactors in which the working fluid is water, either boiling or in liquid form. In the Canadian reactor, the CANDU stands for the Canadian reactor, this light water, H2O, was replaced by D2O, by deuterated water. Very successful Canadian development that has performed extremely well to this day. Well, the RBMK, that's a Russian light water reactor. They got into the act very early also. In fact, while we started it all, we had competition almost immediately after we started. Now we come to the Generation 3 reactors. That's the contemporary period, from about 1995 until today and a little beyond. And there is a whole set of systems there. These are advanced light water reactors, LWR. Light water is simply H2O, to distinguish it from D2O. And the systems are given up there, and they're defined down here. And I do want to say a little bit about those. The AP600 that is listed there is a very important precursor of the next generation of reactors. The AP600 was built in Germany, at Jülich, outside of Aachen. It operated for a very long period of time very successfully. It is a pebble bed, or it was a pebble bed reactor. It is of the type that will be generation 3 plus. Generation 3 plus is, say, 2010 to 2030 or so. These are still like the reactors of the past. And as you can see, there was an advanced boiling point reactor, then a System 80 plus, an advanced pressurized reactor, a European pressurized reactor, and so forth. This is the Department of Energy designation. I will say a little bit about the AP600 because it is a precursor to the next generation, the generation 4 types of reactors. And these are the ones that will have better economy, better safety, minimal waste, and they will be proliferation resistant. That's the future, generation 4. And of course, the reactor builders are working now on the generation 4 type of reactors because to bring a new reactor system into commercial use is a major challenge. What is the difference, the essential difference between the 3 plus and the 3 reactors? The 3 plus is what we are about to build. And these have, for the first time, passively safe systems. What is a passively safe system? What does that mean? It means that the laws of nature prevent accidents. By that I mean, for example, we depend on gravity being gravity. So heavy stuff goes down. And we depend on buoyancy being buoyancy, light stuff going up. These features introduce passive safety into the nuclear reactor technology. And for the first time, we don't depend on operators moving switches around in order to prevent a catastrophe. It's the laws of nature. So remember that a passively safe reactor is safe because it's been built to be safe and doesn't depend on a tired operator, not even on a vigilant operator. But while passive safety features will occur or will be built into the 3 plus generation, the really passive safety systems begin with generation 4. That's an overview of where we've been and where we are going. Pardon me, is there a question? What is, what do passive safety systems do? Well, among the things that a passively safe system will do is prevent a LOCA, that's a loss of coolant accident. As you know, the 3 Mile Island accident was produced by the loss of coolant followed by overheating. We're now talking about systems that have a passive safety feature built in such a way that a LOCA, a loss of coolant accident, simply cannot occur. And the details of that, I'm going to be taking liberties on, because the details are going to be very complex sometimes. And this being an overview, I just want you to get a feel for where we've been and where we're going. So I won't say any more about that, but the first passively safe system was the AP600. The AP600, as I say, was built in Germany and it operated for over 20 years quite successfully. I'm not talking about nuclear waste disposal. That topic belongs to the next speaker who's a real expert on that subject, which I am not. A very important feature of the future generations of nuclear reactors is the fact that reprocessing and proliferation as dangers will be greatly reduced. The reprocessing of nuclear fuel to make weapons will become far more costly and far more technically difficult than it is with the current generation of reactors. And that's a very important feature of the next generation of reactors, because in many ways the fear of proliferation and rogue nuclear bomb makers is a component of our present nuclear generation, and we would like to eliminate that. And with the Pebble Bed Reactors, generation 4 now, not generation 3 plus, that will come about. There's a big alphabet soup in this business, as you might guess, being a governmental undertaking fundamentally. I think there are some 15 different condensation words, but let's just talk about how we got where we are. In a sense, Eisenhower is the one who started the US Atoms for Peace program, and therefore the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, when he proposed in 1953 Atoms for Peace. This was soon followed by the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 that formalized his proposals. Now then, the next thing that came up almost immediately is, what about safety and what about accidents? And it was clear that no private company could do this on its own. And as a result of that, there was an act passed by Congress which offered private insurers something like $60 million in case something went wrong. And this was soon upped by the Congress to over $500 million. Also, around 1970 began the anti-nuclear movement. And the anti-nuclear movement has done very considerable retardation to the progress of development of nuclear reactors, and probably for good reasons, because there are many things that could have gone wrong early that in a sense were interdicted because of the interference of private citizens who were concerned about all kinds of real and imaginary problems. The number one imaginary problem is this NIMBY issue. I'm all for nuclear reactors, but don't build them anywhere near me, not in my backyard. You're all familiar with that phrase. On the other hand, in 1973, the Arab oil embargo made it painfully clear to us that sooner or later we were going to have to find substitutes for imported oil. And I think they did us a favor in a way, because the development of nuclear power electricity was really accelerated by this embargo. And then, to change the words around a little bit, the Atomic Energy Commission was abolished in 1974, replaced by the Energy Research and Development Administration, ERDA, and by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which now supervises the development of nuclear energy in the United States. I have already said a little bit about the boiling and pressurized water reactors. And this is, in a sense, just a repetition of who built all these. The primary builders were General Electric, which built the first boiling water reactor, a small one, 200 megawatts. The Soviet reactor was built within a few years of that time. The GE programs were 1960 to 78. The Soviet reactor 64, so they sort of overlap. And I have mentioned this number before, worldwide 440 of these units. 14 countries are generating electricity that way. And very importantly, there are 8 countries currently building new reactors. We haven't done anything like that in 30 years, but there are 8 countries right now building new reactors. And the reactor construction program worldwide was never really terminated. So it's about time that we got back into this business. And I'm coming here now to the Generation 3+ reactor. The first reactor in about 30 years that is likely to be built in the US. The current status of this is that we have initiatives called New START and Dominion initiatives. And these involve the Department of Energy, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and a consortium of nuclear power generators. In fact, if you add up the nuclear energy in the United States that's generated by the US participants in this New START initiative, it's about 58%. So these are people with extensive experience in generating nuclear electricity for the private sector. And of course, our primary nuclear energy builders, General Electric and Westinghouse, are a part of this consortium, or these consortia, because there really are two. There's one that involves the New START group, and then the Dominion Initiative, which has only 3 members, including Dominion Energy, which I think is the Virginia power generator, General Electric, and Bechtel, a privately held, but one of our most important construction companies. The idea here is that there is going to be $520 million shared, and I think the negotiations for that are already completed. And of this $520 million, 260 comes from the government and 260 from the consortium that is supposedly developing this reactor. This is Generation 3+. It's a modification of what we have been doing. It will almost certainly be a light water reactor. And by 2010, there should be construction permits issued, and then maybe 2013, 14, 15. Who is to say, because the local reviews for environmental mischief they've taken up to 12 years on occasion, but they should be done much shorter time than that, maybe 3 years or even less. So this is our, after 30 years of nothing, re-entry into the nuclear power market. That's this New START initiative. I'm not going to say much about fast breeder reactors. I think I talked about some features of this before, and I wanted to just summarize what I probably said before. Fermi in 1945 said the country which first develops a breeder reactor will have a competitive advantage in atomic energy. That was a prophetic statement, because there is an enormous difference between the breeder reactors and the reactors of the current and past generations. In the breeder reactor, we don't only use high-grade uranium, we also use the very large thorium reserves. And as the result of that, the time horizon for availability of nuclear fuel is not 50 to 100 years, but now depending on how we use the energy, how many people we have to supply energy for, it runs into billions of years. This is a total and complete solution for all times if we succeed in building breeder reactors safely. What killed the breeder program, which was in fact very successful, because there were already small demonstrations prior to 1970 and very large demonstrations after that. There's the Phoenix in France, which was 1,200 megawatts. That's a full type. No, it wasn't quite that much. The next one, the Super Phoenix, was supposed to be that. They operated that. It operated well. There were no real problems with it. And the next generation after that was supposed to be this European fast reactor, also a breeder reactor. But that was terminated. It was all terminated in 1998. What is the reason for terminating the breeder program? Well, the reason was that we found cheap new uranium sources. And therefore, it was possible to plan on doing the lower cost reactors of the past for maybe another 50 to 100 years. And the way we do our economics, if it's cheaper, that's what we do. And that's why the breeder programs all over the world were shut down. It was a mistake in the opinion of all the enthusiasts for breeders, and also in the opinion of many people who are not particularly enthusiasts for breeder, but who like to see plans that will take care of our needs for a very long time in the future. But of course, we were not asked. We had nothing to say about this, so we could only write down where we were. And what we did is we contacted when I say we, it was mostly my colleague Masoud Simnat, formerly from General Atomics, and myself at the university, plus the people who ran the breeder programs in France, in Japan, in Russia, in England, and in Germany. We all got together and wrote down where we were. I had mentioned this before. And when I say this is an all-time solution, let me quantify this, because obviously an all-time solution depends, first of all, how many people there are. Well, we made an optimistic projection that is consistent with current talking, that by the time we have 10 billion people on the planet, that's enough. We don't need more than that. And furthermore, we decided that in order to have a stable world with 10 billion people, they all have to have access to energy, at least at the level where we had it in the year 2000. Because the connection between economic well-being and energy supply is so tight that you can't really talk about a decent standard of living without adequate energy supplies. So if you take these 10 billion happy people and you give them all the amenities which we had around the year 2000, and then ask for how long would the known breeder resources last, the answer is, about 2.5 billion years. Well, that's long enough. Now, I want to come to one of the questions which I was asked by Jane. I think it's a very important question, and I certainly want to address this issue, namely what is going on in China and in Russia. The Chinese have a program to build coastally based nuclear reactors after the German Avr model, which had operated successfully for about 20 years. It failed. We are now talking Pebble Bed reactors. We are now talking generation 4. This is 2035 and later. We don't have the developed technology to build these safe, small reactors that are passively safe, that can't do any harm, that don't allow proliferation on the scale that the current reactors do, that will be, in fact, sort of the solution, maybe the ultimate solution for nuclear reactors. Fred Singer, by the way, first called my attention to this. You know, he publishes this weekly document, TW, and he had one author contributing a brief on the Chinese Pebble Bed program. The Chinese Pebble Bed Reactor program, I call it an inspirational sermon by Singer. That's how we refer to Singer's weekly letter, his inspirational sermon. Of the 5th of September 2004, there is very little risk involved in what the Chinese are doing now. They are building a very small Pebble Bed Reactor. They are going to build it with the help of the nuclear energy experts at Tsinghua University in Beijing, which is a very high-class university. It happens to be an associated university with our university. We have close exchange with them. The people there are highly competent. And of course, this reactor has already worked. This Pebble Bed Reactor in Germany worked from about 64 to 84, some in that time period. It was shut down when one of the little pebbles, and I'll just try to describe these a little bit later, broke up and plugged up the line when it broke up. So it was a minor thing. It could have easily been corrected, but after 20 years, they felt that, well, the time had come to shut it down, particularly in view of the noise that was going on in the streets about anti-nuclear importance, the importance of shutting down nuclear reactors everywhere, because this was a sure road to perdition. We were not alone in that. We had worldwide company in that outside of Russia and China. So this Pebble Bed Reactor that will be built will be a small reactor, only 10 megawatts. It will be a floating reactor. 10 megawatts sounds like nothing to people who have power plants that typically are 1,000 megawatts. They're very small, but a plant like that would be sufficient for a small city like 40,000 people. So it's not a trivial program, and it's a very good way to begin. And the Russians just announced a few weeks ago, the Rosatom, the Russian energy agency, they were going to build something just like that, and they even gave a cost figure and a time figure of 5 years and $180 million. Well, who invented the Pebble Bed Reactor? That's a very good question. In his TWTW report, Fred had an author whose name I've forgotten now, I think Reiser or something like that, who commented that the initial work on this was done by Farrington Daniels at Argonne National Laboratory. Well, that rang a real bell with me, because when I was a graduate student, before I got kicked out of graduate school to work on rockets, which we all had to do, my supervisor, my advisor, thesis advisor for the PhD was Farrington Daniels at the University of Wisconsin. And I remember the first day I walked into his office, he said to me, "I have a project for you. I have a project for you to work on pebble bed heat transfer." And that was the very first assignment I had from him. I think it is clear that even though the Wikipedia is an English encyclopedia on everything connected with energy, attributes the invention of the Pebble Bed Reactor to a German by the name of Schulten, which is probably correct if you change the word invention, the reinvention, because there is very little doubt that at Argonne National Laboratory, what was called the Daniels pile was in fact a Pebble Bed Reactor. It was not built at Argonne because of the enormous prestige that went with Fermi and his initial nuclear reactor development program. But I think it is interesting that so many years after the war, we find out that it was really an American scientist who invented the idea of the Pebble Bed Reactor, which is the Generation 4 plus reactor. There are many people who are working on the Pebble Bed Reactor, including in particular the people at General Atomics. They were pioneers in that field, and they paid a big price for it because they failed on their first attempt to do it on a disproportionately large scale. And I'll go over that in a few minutes. The General Atomics version, of course, has a separate name. It's called the Gas Turbine Modular Helium Reactor, or the GTMHR. It is supposedly a passively safe system. It will be designed as a passively safe system. It will be of moderate size the next time around. And I want to emphasize the importance of that. Now, this is the Avr Reactor, the precursor Pebble Bed Reactor that actually ran in Jülich. And there was another one of this in Untrop. Jülich is the principal atomic energy laboratory in Germany where research and development have been done. And the AVR that they had there used already coated particles that increase passive safety by an enormous factor, because the nuclear reactor is itself contained, the nuclear reaction material, in a small pebble. You see the scale on the side that is 0.5 to 0.7 millimeters, the way they had it. Inside of that is the uranium carbide and the thorium carbide. The initial attempt was a breeder. It was not just a nuclear reactor, it was a nuclear breeder. So we're going back now to technologies that were very successfully done quite a few years ago. I'll describe the pellet that is used in the reactor in a little more detail, because the inventor of that pellet at General Dynamics was my colleague Masoud Simnat. Where does the word AVR come from? Well, it's typical German scripts, Arbeitsgemeinschaft, Versuchsreaktor. You can't make it more complicated than that. So that's obviously where it comes from. It operated at Jülich from 1966 to 1988. And then it was decommissioned because a pebble got stuck somewhere. As I already said, the Chinese have a license to this AVR technology. They are starting where the successful precursor Pebble Bed Reactor left off. They have a license to continue where the Germans quit. And knowing the people there, I have very little doubt that there will soon be successful Pebble Bed Reactors developed in China, and that they are programmed to have 30 modules by 2020 is not completely crazy at all, because this is just repeating what has already been done. It is not the new generation of big reactor where the problems are. I want to emphasize again this proliferation resistance. In fact, if you look at the July 2005 issue of Physics Today, you will find that the American Physical Society group connected with nuclear energy is again worried above all about proliferation, about diversion of nuclear material which could be burnt in the reactor to generate more electricity, diversion into a weapons production channel. So having a system which is proliferation resistance at a much higher level than before is a very important step forward, not only politically, but for all of our comfort and our safety. The Pebble Bed Reactor, that's the Generation 4 new reactor, will be a significant improvement over what we've had in the past in just about every way. Whether or not it will terminate the anti-nuclear movement, I don't really think it will. I think nothing will terminate the anti-nuclear movement, because there are things on issues underfoot other than technology and safety. Like there are it's been discussed, there are too many people, and the best thing to do is to starve them of energy, and then maybe there won't be so many. I think there are other people who have elaborated on this issue. I don't need to go into that. But I do think that the proliferation-resistant feature of the next generation is technically a very important step in the right direction. The question is, who is the international leader in Pebble Bed Reactor development now? Well, this Wikipedia, this English free encyclopedia, which has all kinds of things in it, says that the principal development is in South Africa. And my colleagues at General Atomics generally agree with the idea that they have a very vital and active program on passively safe, non-polluting proliferation. Don't read proof as 100% proof, but proliferation more resistant than in the past, low-cost reactor module. And if they get the money that they want, they will be building 10 of these reactors for local use and 20 for export every year. But they are also blessed in South Africa with opposition from environmental groups. So they are likely to be somewhat impeded in their ambitious programs as well. I want to say a few words about inherent safety features in this MBPR, and the best way to do that is for me to look at the detailed design of the nuclear fuel. The detailed design, and this is more or less standard around the globe, although this particular version is the general atomic version. And as I think I mentioned, Masoud Simnat, who was, this has been a close connection between General Atomics and our energy center since the beginning. Typically, our nuclear expert is a retiree from General Atomics, and not a retiree because of incompetence, but rather because he just got a little bit fed up or too old or wanted to do something else, and so he became an adjunct professor at the university with a higher work schedule than before, but more love and affection, something of that sort. So the fuel is called this, it's a triso-coated. Triso is a proprietary name of General Atomic, and it consists essentially of a pyrolytic, the uranium oxycarbide is in the core. So that is where the nuclear fuel is contained. And it is embedded in porous carbon. And the porous carbon is surrounded by a layer of pyrolytic carbon, which is surrounded by a shell of silicon carbide, which is surrounded by another shell of pyrolytic carbon. And the feature of this fuel is it's a microscopic containment, or miniature, not microscopic, miniature containment vessel for the fuel. Nothing much can go wrong with it. The fuel has got to stay in this shell. It can't get out of it because the melting points of these successive shells are very, very much higher than the temperature at which this fuel system operates. The fuel system operates at about 1600 C, and none of these shells will even begin to soften or melt until the temperatures are well above 2000 C. But you can't go above 2000 C because this is a passively safe system. If it gets warmer, the fissionable material will be absorbed in the successive layers of this inner shell. And the net result is that if you have nothing at all, this can't heat much above about 1800 degrees. It's a self-limiting process. It's the laws of physics that guarantee this self-limiting heating. At around 1800 degrees or so, that's where it'll go. And then the auxiliary passive systems kick in, and the whole system will be cooled down well below the current temperature back to the original operating temperature. The General Dynamics version of the Pebble Bed Reactor doesn't quite look like a Pebble Bed Reactor. They call it a Prismatic Bed Reactor. They were concerned about the fact that in the original AV experiment in Jülich, a pebble got into the line and broke up, and that would have caused a shutdown or something of that sort. So they have a geometric design that they call a prismatic fuel, but it does all the same things as the Pebble Bed Reactor does, except that you don't have little pebbles around that could clog up the line. The details of that are not important to discuss here. The next change that they've made, they've replaced the power cycle for heating the helium, which is the working fluid in the general atomic reactor, instead of water, light water or heavy water. It's helium, by a Brayton cycle, which significantly raises the thermal efficiency of the auxiliary system. And as the result of this system will be more efficient and safer than anything else that has been proposed. Now let's take a look at some recent international developments of all this. This we don't need to look at in detail. These are statements about safety. Negative temperature coefficient shuts down the core, and things like that that ensure the passive safety of the system. Well, I somehow managed to lose a couple of things that I didn't want to lose. That's one of them. This is another. About a month ago, I got a report from the Paul Scherrer Institute in Zurich dealing with their nuclear program for Switzerland. And the question that they asked in this report is, what are we going to do as our nuclear reactors age and have to be retired? And what are we going to build that is new? And I want to make an important point here that is illustrated above the table there. Originally, these reactors were built to last 25 to 35 years. But, contrary to the impressions that you may have, they have lasted much longer than that. And many of them have been approved for 50 to 60-year operation. And as a result of that, the obsolescence in that industry is far below original estimates. To be sure, some of the conventional systems have to be upgraded periodically and replaced. But the core system, the nuclear system, does in fact last a long time. And so these reactors will be around a long time. They have quite a few years left in Switzerland as well. And what did the Swiss do? Well, the Swiss said, let's look at Generation 4 systems. It is understood that they're now talking 2035 and beyond. What are we going to be building then? And they looked particularly at the Pebble Bed Reactors. In fact, there's a whole set of reactors that they looked at. And their conclusion was that there's a little prejudice in the conclusion. They don't like the Super Phoenix from France for some reason. So they were not going to consider that at all. But the net result, the net conclusion of their analysis is what they want is a very high temperature gas-cooled reactor, the VHTR. That, of course, is the General Atomics reactor. And I don't have to tell you that my colleague from General Atomics was delighted with this kind of an outcome, which he classified as totally reasonable. Now, what is the story on the General Atomics history? What have they been doing over time? Let's take a look at the first line there. Pebble Bed Reactors, advanced Pebble Bed Reactors. There's one in the UK. It produced only thermal energy, 20 megawatts, no electricity. The next line is the Peach Bottom Reactor, built by General Atomics. And then the AVR, the German reactor. The Peach Bottom Reactor stumbled for about 7 years. I think that's the right word. This one really operated for over 20 years. And then you see there is an entry there called Fort St. Vrain. When I founded the Energy Center at UCSD in 1972, one of my first trips was out to Fort St. Vrain in Colorado because my friends at General Atomics said, this is the future. It's still the future. They built a reactor much too large for the time. You see, there had been experience at the time on this very small scale, 15 megawatts electrical, the AVR. And they were building a 330 megawatt electrical immediately. A scale up of that magnitude never succeeds, or almost never succeeds. Unless you have divine blessing, it won't succeed. You have to go slowly. You scale up a factor of 2 or 4 in steps like that. You don't go in one step by more than a factor of 20. That just is bad engineering practice. And the people at General Atomic paid the price for that optimism, because Fort St. Vrain, being a 330 megawatt electrical reactor, was very expensive and it never really worked right, and it was finally shut down after much stumbling over about a 10-year period. Of the current reactors that began in 1998, there are 2 in operation, one in Japan and the one I've talked about in China. The Chinese one is the AVR all over again, but on a smaller scale. They're being very circumspect about the way they do their business. The Japanese reactor, I think, is a reasonable scale up from the AVR, because the AVR had 46 megawatt thermal and they have only 30 in Japan, and they're saying that after such a long time lapse, it's reasonable to be conservative and start over again. But the important conclusion from all this is that probably the General Atomic Reactor, which has been blessed now by the Swiss analysis as the right way to go, restarted on a small scale, will give us a helium-cooled reactor. The working fluid is helium. You don't have to do anything with the helium other than, since it doesn't get radioactive, use it directly in the power cycle. That's a big advantage too. And it's chemically inert, so in every way it is an almost ideal way to generate electricity in a nuclear reactor with safety, with assured safety. Now there's a postscript to the General Atomic development. They want to sell this, and because they want to sell it, they have also decided that the hydrogen technology that I talked about last year is the way to enter the market, because there is so much political pressure behind funding that kind of a thing, and they point out the obvious fact that the way these systems are designed, they're almost ideal for producing hydrogen on a large scale in various ways, which again I discussed last year, for the transportation sector. So this is more or less the end of my lecture. I won't go into the hydrogen production schemes again, because I spent a whole hour on that the last time. And I point out this last reference 10, the use of the modular helium reactor for hydrogen production, is the General Atomics view, fairly recent paper on what can be done that way. And that's the end of my lecture, and I think it's time to look now at nuclear waste disposal in detail. I think there'll be no questions.